Yeah, I'll react to that, sure. Okay. Hi, my name's Connor if you're new. I have a cut on the side of my mouth and it really hurts and I hate it. So I have a guess. All right, why does the world speak English? I think with globalization, it would have been inevitable that one language would have become the, what is it, lingua franca? It's just easier, and so I think we would be asking why did this language or whatever it ended up being. But I'm sure Britain's influence around the world with the, colonization and whatnot played a big part. So let's learn. Let's go. All the links, I just shivered. Top of the description. Would love to have you on the Discord. Again, the original link to this video, top of the description. I just said that. Let's go.
This is Spanish, and this is the number of people in the world who speak English as a first language. This is Spanish, and this is Mandarin Chinese. But if we also include second language speakers in this figure, then English is by far the biggest language in the world. But why does the whole world speak English? And what is the language that's going to replace English within our lifetimes? And I'll give you a hint, it's not Spanish, and it's not Mandarin either. First things first, languages come...
Arabic? No. I don't know, sorry.
I'll give you a hint, it's not Spanish, and it's not Mandarin either. First things first, languages come and go. Right now, it's English, but it wasn't always that way. Remember Latin? 2,000 years ago, what would Caesar have said if you'd sat down and said, Caesar, in the not too distant future, Latin will be spoken by approximately nobody. You would have been laughed out of town or possibly thrown into a ring with Russell Crowe.
Oh, great movie.
But you see, linguistic power is not just about who's wearing the crown or carrying the whip. There's something else at play that makes languages catch on, and it's not size either. Size doesn't matter, guys, when it comes to languages.
True.
After all, Russia,
It doesn't.
China, big countries, lots of speakers, but none of them are anywhere near as popular as English. Quick story. Many years ago, there were two languages, Aramaic and Hebrew. Now, Aramaic had the exact same origins as Hebrew, but while Hebrew stayed localized in a small geographical area, Aramaic, on the other hand, spread like wildfire over a vast territory until it was the lingua franca of the entire Persian Empire. How come? Well, Aramaic speakers were the adventurous, nomadic type, conquerors too.
The Bible
was for later. And back then, language got around with human carriers. Even the Persian...
I gotta stop talking. This is... I really need to... Okay.
Well, Aramaic speakers were the adventurous, nomadic type, conquerors too. Put a pin in this for later. And back then, language got around with human carriers. Even the Persian king Darius chose Aramaic as the language to rule with, not Persian. So languages move with people. A couple of thousand years later, in the 17th century, Latin becomes our lingua franca, and then in the 18th...
Just a question, guys, if anyone knows, is Farsi related to... Like, did it grow from earlier Persian languages, or is it... Did it come from something else, and it's also... is That's my question.
A couple of thousand years later, in the 17th century, Latin becomes our lingua franca, and then in the 18th century, French became super popular as Europe's lingua franca as well. It was only during the 20th century that English started overtaking French, and before long, English was the most widely spoken and written language that has ever existed. That's right, English is the world's first global lingua franca. Let me know in the comments if you think it's going to stay that way. I'll let you know what I think in just a minute. But hold up, what exactly made English go viral in the first place? Was it YouTube? No. In fact, English wasn't always such a beast. The first Britons had been indigenous Celtic people. Then the Latin-speaking Romans came along and conquered them, but then in the year 410 AD the Romans left, but their language stayed, and then came this.
Goeie, ik ben Sjoukje. Ik woon in Friesland. Het is een van de noordelijke provincies van Nederland. In Friesland praten we Fries.
That was a Frisian language that came with Germanic migrants who arrived in Britain between the 5th and 7th centuries AD. That left us with a language which we call Old English, which was spoken by the Anglo-Saxons who eventually went on to form England. Now fast forward to the 16th century and the English-speaking British Empire was taking root. Now remember what we saw earlier about Aramaic. Aramaic spread when Hebrew didn't because of the way that the Aramaic people were. They liked to move around and conquer stuff. And the British, well, we were kind of the same. Small territory, like to move around, like to conquer stuff. Except this time they had ships. And so the English language was transported all across the world by sailors, pilgrims, traders, missionaries, and a lot of those went from Europe all across the pond to the Americas. Now, it is true that the French and the Dutch were doing exactly the same thing around this time, but the difference was the French and the Dutch were interested in natural resources, whereas the British wanted to settle. So by the 18th century, the empire had a presence across almost a quarter of the world's surface. Canada, Africa, Australia, New Zealand, the Indian subcontinent, the future United States. The sun literally never set on the British Empire. Take the British East India Company, for example. They traded in India for more than a century.
Before we get to that, guys,
empire had a presence across almost a quarter of the world's surface.
It's kind of also crazy because of how much Spanish dominates. I mean, all of it Spanish, Portuguese for Brazil, but not to say that's not a giant chunk, but the fact that all of these continuous countries speak Spanish is pretty crazy in itself.
Surface, Canada, Africa, Australia, the British Empire. Take the British East India Company, for example. They traded in India for more than a century, so it's easy to see how the English language gained a foothold with the local people. So by 1922, Great Britain was the largest empire the world had ever seen. But again, previous lingua francas came and went, so what made English different? Well, remember the timescale we're talking about with English is still quite short, relatively. So even though English is everywhere right now, it might not stay that way. More on that later. But the thing with English was quite simple. Timing. Perfect timing made English establish itself as the world's common language. English walked center stage at a time when three revolutionary things were happening: print, widespread literacy, and the media. Therefore, unlike the fates of Aramaic and Latin, English grew wings. Out of the many lingua francas that have come and gone over the centuries, English just happened to be the one that was dominant when widespread media and literacy hit the world. And from that moment on, it was like a snowball. Books to read, radio to listen to, the Beatles, Pink Floyd, the Rolling Stones. It's not that there wasn't anything good going on in other languages or other cultures, because heaven knows we know that there was. It's just that English was the common language around the world at a time when information and entertainment was spreading globally for the very first time. Right place, right time. But of course, entertaining things are not just for entertaining, they're also perfect for learning languages because they give you immersion in the language with material that you love. In fact, I have 25 rules for language learning, and this is rule number 8. Move heaven and earth to find compelling input. You can read more about this in a free PDF that has all 25 of the rules of language learning, and I'll put a link in the description below to that. So what's the role of Uncle Sam in all of this? Well, English was already well established in the US, and a lot had been done to cement English as the national language in a country full of immigrants. In the early 1900s, a lot of states had even gone as far as banning the teaching of foreign languages. There's some more background to that in this video over here. By the time of the First World War, the US had already established significant economic and political power, but a pivotal moment came with the signing of the Treaty of Versailles after the First World War. Traditionally, treaties were always written in French, but this one was written in French and English, and this cemented the
I feel like I've heard that before, but I don't remember it, and that's interesting.
Treaties were always written in French,
written in French.
This one was written in French and English, and this cemented the position of English as one of the diplomatic languages of the world. After that, you had the US helping to reconstruct Europe after World War II, so increasing influence there. But then you had the huge waves of pop music, pop, rock, jazz, hip-hop, things like that coming from the US, and then the emerging power of Hollywood, which became a global sensation. And then you got really weird things like Friends, which for some reason everyone seems to like. After 2 back-to-back wars, there was something about the American language and culture that just seemed to radiate success across the world. But there's more. You see, from way back in the 1700s already, English was becoming the language of science and technology. And as money started moving more globally, people wanted a piece of whatever language it was that was earning the money. Britain and the US were 2 of the world's most productive nations. And so before you know it, English was the language of air traffic control. And then, of course, later came the internet. So now technology and innovations are taking place 100% in English. So if you want to sum it all up, the British Empire spread English. America gave it power, and the people, well, they just loved it. But do they still love it? Do they still want English?
I think he's going to get into the possibility of it not being the main language, but I would imagine that the further along that you get in accepting English as the main, lingua franca or, intermediary language between most countries, then the more difficult it is to change it, because it'll just be more of a hassle.
English Well, look, as a
I explained that horribly. I hope that made sense.
power, and the people, well, they just loved it. But do they still love it? Do they still want English? Well, look, as a language learning channel, I know a lot of you will not be so pleased about the role of English in the world. And for me, to be honest, it's a bit of a mixed blessing. I kind of get depressed sometimes in environments where only English is spoken and people behave as if they have the God-given right to travel the world and have everyone speak to them in English. In fact, the whole mission of this channel and of story learning in general, and all my books and language courses, is to get English people, English-speaking people, to learn other languages. And by the way, if you think that's a good mission, then you should subscribe to this channel and turn on notifications too. But
I've loved
let's
this
get real.
video so far. Definitely subscribing. And yeah, it's a mix. You know, it's the immediate thing is, oh yeah, I'm so glad I don't have to learn another language. Well, it's a little weird knowing that, I don't know if weird's that anyone can really understand you, but then other people know a second language, a lot of other people, and it's like they have their own secret language, but everyone understands English. And it'd be cool to know another language, and I think the added pressure would... You get what I mean, right?
If you think that's a good mission, it's to get English people, English-speaking people, to learn other languages. And by the way, if you think that's a good mission, then you should subscribe to this channel and turn on notifications too. But let's get real. English is the international language of business. Big companies want staff who speak English. Scientific journals are published in English. Kids have to learn English in schools around the world, and you can't get far on the internet without running up against English. But the big question is this permanent? Is English always going to be the world's lingua franca? Everyone seems to think that Mandarin Chinese is the language of the future, but me, I'm not so sure. See, I think the biggest barrier to this happening for the Chinese language is online censorship in China. Because although China is gaining bigger political influence all the time across the world,
我爱更尊重中国更中国人，我很抱歉对我的错误。
What did he say?
that's not
Taiwan.
enough by itself. Remember what was needed for English to spread like wildfire across the world? It's that cultural exchange, this back and forth. And as long as China maintains the great firewall, preventing you from watching sites like YouTube, you cannot legally watch this video in China right now. As long as that happens, it's difficult to see how there's enough cultural back and forth in order for the Chinese language to really gain roots across the world. Not forgetting, of course, the Chinese script itself, which, as we know, ain't no walk in the park to learn. But there is one other language that is doing a better job of establishing itself as the potential next
Arabic,
lingua franca
just a
for the
guess.
world. And it is, wait for it, French.
Dang
Not
it.
what you were expecting, right? Well, look at this. Right here and here. This is French-speaking Africa.
I have
And
no justification for why I said Arabic, if you're wondering. I just thought of it.
not what you were expecting, right? Well, look at this. Right here and here. This is French-speaking Africa. And what's most interesting is that although French isn't the native language for a
Big
lot of these
population
people,
boom.
it is rapidly becoming the lingua franca and spreading throughout Africa, especially among young people. And this, in my opinion, is a sign of things to come, especially when you think that birth rates here in these
Yeah, that
francophone
makes
countries
sense.
are the highest in the world. This might be why some experts say that if China does one day rule the world, they won't necessarily do it in Mandarin. Because let's not forget, English also is not the easiest of languages. And right here are 10 reasons why not.
Thanks, guys, for watching along. That was a really cool video. I am a bit curious if there's anyone who learned English in their later in life, if they thought it was a difficult language to learn or not. I'm kind of curious. But yeah, it was a really cool video. Glad I've came across this channel, and I'd appreciate any comments, guys, and I will see you guys next time. Bye.